Well, welcome back. I'm Mark Bremer, and on behalf of Renderosity, thanks for tuning into this second and intermediate series of tutorials on POSER Pro 2014 and POSER 10. In this movie, we're going to take a look at ways to optimize or work more efficiently when you do scene building, especially inside of buildings for interior types of rendering. This is a different strategy than working for outdoor scenes that you might have, and we'll be covering that in a movie that comes up next. In this movie right here, there's a couple things we need to look at. One is how textures and POSER's render engine kind of mesh together and just come up with some common terms based on texture-based types of shading. POSER has a fantastic numeric or mathematical, you can call it procedural types of materials and shaders that you can work with. And man, there's so many things you can do that's worth 20 hours worth of tutorials right there. But most of the types of materials we interact with that also come with scenes you can buy from some great vendors are texture based. There's ways that you can optimize those, although they're pretty good when you get them. You can just plug and play. But there's ways you can approach using them a little more efficiently, and more importantly, there's some ways you can use POSER to import other content and create some fantastic looking scenes easily that render quickly as long as you know the tool sets. And that's the goal of this tutorial, is that you become more familiar with how textures integrate with the render options and how to control render speeds. In the movie before this, the tutorial, I talked about using normal maps as a way to get more definition on an object. Games like PS3 games and Xbox and PC games rely extensively on normal mapped textures to create the illusion of texture and bumps on tops of surfaces. Let me show you what I mean. I'll bring over a little Photoshop file, and we're going to apply this texture to that little POSER scene you saw. This is just a texture map. Now, Photoshop lets you create normal maps, and I'll show you what they look like. You go up to Filter if you happen to have this, and there's other tools you can make normal maps. I'll show one in just a second. But you come to 3D and generate normal map. It takes the image information and turns it into this kind of rainbow picture that instructs POSER that we've got a much more complex type of analysis. It's not just up and down, it's also left and right. So this colored normal map creates bumps that POSER interprets not only as up and down, but in a more of a 3D space. I don't particularly like Photoshop's version here because there are no controls, and I have found the normal maps generated by Photoshop to actually put in too much small detail and not really help you out that way. There's also the option to create bump maps if you want to in that. You might have seen that, the little option right here. Actually, if I just do Command Z and we come back to this, that too is under Filter 3D Generate Bump Map, which is just kind of a high contrast image. Well, let me show you an option to this and further explain a little bit more about what normal maps do in a way that's really easy to see. This is created with a software called Crazy Bump, and if you have a Mac, I think you can still get versions of it for free. If you've got a PC, it costs, but there's other tool sets out there, so you can just do a search on Google for normal map generators and come up with them. What I like about this, and so you can see it's the same texture we were working with before, is that dynamically I can go in here and control detail. It's got this little spinning ball right here that lets me control or see what happens when I work with controls for things like very large detail. If I crank this up, it takes a second and we see now we've got a lumpier surface. Additionally, this Crazy Bump software and some of the other normal map softwares allow you to create not only normal maps, but displacement maps, occlusion maps, and specularity. Displacement is if we want to actually change the geometry based on the texture information. Occlusion is where light kind of disappears. The object blocks the lighting. If we come to this, we can see we've got a high contrast image. And right here in the preview, if I come down to Options and enable Ambient Occlusion, we'll see it fills in the dark spaces. And this is exactly what it does when you start using it with the textures inside of POSER. Pretty cool stuff. So if we come back to normals, we'll see this dynamically update right here if we go ahead and change some of the information right here. If we increase very fine detail and really push that up, yeah, we get more texture going on and so forth. So it's a really cool way to go ahead and create some really powerful tools that render faster than bump maps when using image-based lighting inside of POSER. Okay, now that we know what normal maps are, let's pop into POSER again and take a look at some of these things. I'm going to click on this plane right here at the very bottom, the cloth plane, and it is selected cloth plane right here. We'll come over to the material editor in the top tab, and let me close some of this down. Holy cow, give us a little more room here to work. Now, what I need to do here inside this is add a texture map for that. So what I will do, and maybe I should go ahead and shrink this back down, I'm going to right click with my mouse and say new node. And we're going to come down to 2D textures and we'll choose image map. It pops up and there's a little button that says none right here, or word. If you actually click on the word none, it opens a window where you can drive to where the texture map is. So I've already got this set up. It's the stone texture color right here, and we'll just choose OK. We'll choose OK again. And then what we need to do is connect this node to the diffuse color channel right here. Now if we go ahead and expand the little eye right here in the top right corner, we can see the texture map if we need verification, and if we click the next icon next to it, it shrinks right up. So that's perfect, and we can do the same thing. I don't have enough room in this window right here to show everything, so I'll have to scroll it. But as you can see, we have got this texture now on our cloth plane. Well, the next thing we'd want to do is import some of those other maps I generated with the Crazy Bump software. And you can actually just link over the image map if you wanted to something like bump. If we do that and just pull it down to bump right here, this changes a little bit, and it's kind of hard to see when the screen's small, but if you're doing it on your own system, and let me kind of zoom in here just a little bit, you'll be able to see some of the differences. What I don't like about working with black and white bump maps, if I change this and I'll disconnect it, is that it gives a more contrasty interpretation of the texture. And this just is a big flag of CG when you see it. It's a giveaway that you're working with CG, and I like to hide that a little bit more. So let's talk about how we use normal maps inside of POSER. I'm simply going to copy this by highlighting it, and I can right click on it and say copy, and then click paste. And we just simply get another image map, and what I want to do is rename this so I can keep it organized for myself and my pathetic little brain while I work on it. You just double click on the name, and I'll call this normal. I'll go ahead and disclose the information right here. We'll click on the stone texture, but this time when I choose browse, what I'll do is come over to the stone texture normal map, and I'm not going to engage the occlusion and all those types of things at the moment. I want to just simply talk about bumps at this point. So we'll choose that and validate it in there. And now where you plug in a normal map is coming down to gradient bump. And let me release right here. And it really doesn't do anything when you first look at it, because the next thing you need to do to modify how it's applied is come down to the gradient mode. It starts with gradient bump, but for most applications inside of POSER, what you want to do is select the option for normal map object space. What this does is the normals, which are these little imaginary lines that come up from the polygons, if we're talking with the sphere, they radiate out like a fan. In the case of this flat square, they're going up, and when I change this, we see now we get a complete different presentation right here. If I go to normal map tangent space, this looks a little more like we want it, and you'll just have to try it based on the objects you've got and see which one works best. There's no right or wrong, it's which one works right for the particular scene you have. So if we shrink this up a little bit, we can see now that we're getting more definition in here, and I can come in here with my specular color and the image map, and I can drag it into specular color, and this will change it so it's not quite so plasticky looking. And we can change how aggressive this is by adjusting this grayscale value right here. If we want the specular color to be a little bit darker, then we make this gray color a little bit darker as well. And then it hides some of that. So these are ways you can add that extra detail in there. Now I mentioned it renders faster, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But before we do that, what I would like to do is to go ahead and look at how POSER handles reflections as well. Let's select this object right here in the materials room, and we will just apply, let's come over here to, well, let's come to window and just open our library. And it opens down here. Let's go to materials, which is the little palette. And let's see, if we go to basic materials, we will find glass down here. Let me keep scrolling a little bit. And let's go with something like crystal ball. Now, before I apply this, I want to tell you that POSER is built around taking shortcuts. All 3D and CG software is based on a sleight of hand and misdirection. It's all fake. And POSER does not deal with environmentals. It's never been built to do that. Remember, it was built to really focus on people and characters and bring those in at this point in time to other software. So it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of some of the other 3D software, which is content generation software. POSER is content manipulation software. So what it does is it fakes things like reflections. If I bring crystal ball over here and we drop it right on top of the sphere, we'll see it change. And if I do a render real quickly, Command or Control R depending on your system, we'll see it render up, and it's got just the standard stock lights that come in the scene. Looks like we've got some reflectivity going on, and if we come down into our materials editor here, we'll see something kind of interesting, and that happens to be what is showing up. In the reflection color, or specular color, sometimes they'll go ahead and map in reflection, and we don't have that going on right here. Let's go ahead and try another one. Oops, as I scroll too fast through that. We go with something like glass right here. We can see it's got all these reflections built in. Let me double click on that. It applies it. Let's go ahead and render that again, and we'll see it a little bit differently. We're going to actually start working with reflections in a way in POSER where you go ahead and eliminate these preset types of reflection things. The eye looks at this, and POSER uses it a lot for human eyes, reflections that you are used to seeing, and so it kind of fakes it so it doesn't actually have to calculate the reflections. Well, let's change this, and I'll show you what we'll do here. I am going to eliminate the transparency actually in this case. I'll highlight the transparency and just click 0. Let me come back to our preview, and let's apply a little bit of a color so we can just see what's going on here, and we'll give it a red in here or something like that. I want reflection, but I don't want this spherical map going on, and this is where we get into how POSER thinks and talks to the render engine. Reflections are a function of something called ray tracing. If we come up to the render settings, we'll see that there's a little option in the checkbox here for ray tracing in the Firefly renderer. Usually you'll always want to leave that checked unless you've got a system that's on its knees because it's so old and can't render some things. So let me go ahead and just cancel out of this. I am going to delete these items for spherical map and imagery and all these types of things. And don't worry, when you delete these, you're not actually deleting content from the shader. It's just the one that's in your file. What we need to do to make this an actual reflective surface is add a special ray traced node in the material room for this material. I'm going to right click, new node, and we come down to lighting. This is kind of a counterintuitive. It's not something you would expect. And we come down to ray traced, and it flies off the screen. Let me see if I can pull this over a little bit. Working with a small area for this recording. All right, let's come to lighting, ray trace, and we'll see reflect. I'm going to bring this in right here, and what you do is you plug this reflect into reflection value. This allows the system to think about this as a reflective surface now. So if we come down here, we may not see it that way, but let's go ahead and collapse this just a little bit. Remember, all it's going to reflect is what's around it. So if we go ahead and render this now, it'll think about it for a second, and it renders in, and gosh, we're still not seeing it, so I am missing something here. Let's see what that is. I plugged this into the wrong item. See how I am? Let's disconnect and drag this back into reflection color. Success, here we go. So we've got two components that are affected by this new reflection node that's in the lighting options when you find it. We'll leave it at white, and if we leave this at 100%, this is going to be a highly reflective surface. We don't see it in the preview, but let's go ahead and do a render again. and that pops in there real quick. And now we see it reflecting the cylinder next to it. We see it reflecting the ground surface. Great. So now we can see that there are ways that POSER thinks about how you see reflected surfaces, and we can see ways about how POSER thinks about working with bumps, and I like using normal maps for that. Something else that's going on right here is we see this darkening as we get near edges. This is called ambient occlusion. And occlude means to block or cover up. What happens in real world, if you look at the desk around you or the table, is that as you get nearer an object, the light starts to get a little bit darker. And that's what's going on right here. If we check any of the lights in the material room, and let's go ahead and choose object, lights, and let's just pick one at random. There is something, and let me close this library here so we can start working with all the tool sets. This is an image-based light right here, so let me choose another light. It's got ambient occlusion enabled, and I'm going to turn this off. Let's check a couple of our other lights. Light 2, we'll turn that off, and it's probably on all the lights. It is. This is one of the ways that POSER goes ahead and cheats reality by engaging ambient occlusion. If I render the scene again real quickly, what happens is that these dark areas disappear. Now, when I say it fakes it, there's two ways to render indoor scenes inside of POSER. The fastest way is to use ambient occlusion with these features that I just turned off. In fact, we can go ahead on a per object basis. If I highlight the material for the cylinder, we can actually add under the ray tracing lighting area. See if I can keep my mouse under control. And let's shrink this up so you can see what I'm selecting here. We'll come down to ray trace. There's a specific item called ambient occlusion. Not trying to confuse things here, but you've got this tremendous ability to control all these things inside of POSER, and that's important, especially if you get a complex scene, in having a file that renders in your lifetime versus one that never completes. So for ambient occlusion, this is something that you plug into diffuse value, and you go ahead and plug into specular value. Now let me shrink this up just a little bit. When we render here, let's see if it's noticeable first. Now we can see these dark edges appearing around the object again. Why is this important? It's because you can create the illusion of atmospheric light by simple shader nodes and not even request that POSER calculate real-world types of lighting. If we adjust any of the values in here for like maximum distance in the object, if I increase this to something like 1, and the ray bias, I won't get into that. Usually you can leave that just where it is unless you're doing a whole bunch of displacement type of mapping. And we'll leave the strength at 1. Oh, let's increase it to 2 maybe, just so we can see it a little bit better. There's an option to evaluate in IDL, which stands for Indirect Lighting, and we'll take a look at that here in just a second. So with this new feature engaged right here, let me go ahead and render one more time. And we'll see the ambient occlusion get a little bit larger. If I drag this little divider, you can see, yep, we increased it, and it's a little more prevalent in the second render, but not obnoxiously so. So we've spent a lot of time looking at shaders and how POSER starts working with them, both for ambient occlusion, for bumps, and reflection. It's now time to get into an indoor scene and see how we make all this work together. So let me go ahead and come over here to our pose window, and I'm simply going to close this. Don't need to save this, and let's open this up and come into a scene I have pre-built right here. Interior. And this is not a scene that comes with POSER. It's something that was created in another software that I went ahead and imported in here. It's thinking about it. It's a 74 meg file, so just a second here. Let me back out so you can see exactly what we're working with. And this is a building that obviously looks like it's got an outdoor scene. It's because I put in a backdrop, and I'll talk about how to do that in just a second. What we're interested in, though, is the indoor rendering. So let me go ahead and come up just a little bit. And zoom into our scene. I'm holding the Command Control key while I scroll in with my mouse just a little bit. And we've got our good friend Ryan right here. Now I've got only 2 lights in this scene. They are a sunlight, and then I have an image-based light. So let's go ahead and choose lights, sun. This is just if I come over here to the properties, an infinite light that I inserted, and I have a value for it under parameters of the intensity. Let's just pop into the render, or not the render, the material room real quickly. The color is just kind of a light warm right here, and the intensity is 3. The default is 1 right there. I want this to be a very bright type of warm light. Let me shrink this just a little bit. We don't need to see quite all of that. And it's not going to let me shrink it any further. So there. Let's come back to the pose room real quickly. And let me move around the scene just a little bit. Now, this is the fastest way to render an indoor scene, with a light outside that is an infinite light that you can go ahead. It's just like the sun. But we've got some issues with it, and let me show you what those are real quickly. We'll check our render settings real quick. And all I have got on are the standards. I even turned off subsurface scattering on this one. We'll come in later and tune or turn on indirect lighting, but that takes more time to render, so we're going to look at the fastest ways first. Let me cancel here. And when I do a render, we see it calculate real quickly. The less lights in a scene you have, the faster it's going to render. Now there are some image-based lighting presets, and I'll talk about those in just a second, but I like to, if I can avoid it, not use those because they usually throw in 3 or 4 lights and it just takes a little longer for calculation. Not a big deal if I can get away with not using it. So what we're seeing is the backdrop outside of the window, but everything is rendering dark until we get down to the bottom. This is the sunlight coming in through the windows in the scene. The windows have a transparency and they have a reflection value that I added by using that same trick I just covered, where you go ahead and add a reflection light node to the reflective property of the material, so we get reflected things in the scene that we'll be seeing. Now this is totally dark. Well, here is the way to approach an indoor scene with POSER. We've got this bright sunlight, but POSER does not deal with something called radiosity particularly well, and that's something we'll deal with in indirect lighting, where it figures out the environment you're working in. This is what image-based lighting is about. In the library, if we come over to lights, there's a whole bunch of options for image-based lighting. There is image-based lighting, and then let's go ahead and scroll this real quick. And it has, well, images that are used as the source of the light. Instead of having like a single bulb, it takes the color information in the file and applies it to the light and applies it uniformly in the scene. This is a way of faking ambient light in a scene, just the light that's around, not the sunlight per se, but all the reflected light. But look, there is image-based lighting, there's image-based lighting ambient occlusion, there's HDR VFX lighting. What is the difference between all these? Well, the difference between image-based lighting and image-based ambient occlusion lighting is a checkbox. They can be the exact same thing. And when we come to the image-based lighting, we'll take a look at in just a second, all you do is turn on or off a checkbox, and that's what these do. They throw in a couple other lights occasionally for some rim lights or those types of things, but I like to build my own. So let me close this up. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. This is a different type of photographic process. You can also create files like this in Photoshop, and these lights have much more intense brights and colors, a little more realistic. If you've got an object that is being reflective and you want to map a spherical type of HDR file onto it, it will look much more believable. Really cool stuff. But let's look at how image-based lighting changes a scene. I have the sun selected now. Let's go over to the material editor right here. And this gives us some options. I'm just going to select lights, and we're going to come down to image-based lighting. I have the value turned down, or the intensity, to 0. So I'm going to turn this up to 1. And when I do that, let me go ahead and click the Enter key. We see no difference over here until, let me change the preview now. We use the textured preview. It'll think for a second. Okay, longer than a second. And now we can see our entire scene. It's not dark. If I render real quickly, let's What's going to happen is that look how fast this is rendering up. It's just adding some of the objects in the scene. And remember, this is a 74 meg file, not counting, well, it's counting our good friend Ryan. Now, quite simple, this looks kind of fake. We've got all these flat colors going on here. Don't know if I can shrink this down a little bit to let me come back to the pose room right here. I know I can shrink this down and make that a little bit larger. We come up in our scene. It's kind of this cool high or expensive type of environment. You've got this little catwalk and there's another room with a television over here. If I render this, and we're looking out the window here, again, this renders very, very quickly, but it's not going to look particularly real. And that's okay. That is what the difference is between image-based lighting without ambient occlusion and with ambient occlusion. So I labeled my light IBL. If we come over to properties, we'll let that finish rendering, and I've got some reflections going on here on the wood floor as well. You can also soften these up so they aren't quite so harsh. It does take longer to render though. If I come to properties for my IBL light, and if you're inserting new lights, you can come to object, create light. You got spotlight, you know what that is, an infinite light, which my sun is, a point light, which is like a bulb, and a diffuse IBL. The HDR lights, the IBL ambient occlusion, and just the IBL lights are all this diffuse IBL. Let me turn on ambient occlusion. We'll go ahead and re-render the scene right now, and you'll see a tremendous change that takes place. By the way, while this is calculating that real quickly, you've got the option to turn on shadows. Normally you don't do that with the image-based lighting because you get terrible results with that. But look what's going on here. We're starting to get these darkened corners just like in the real world. This is a really, really fast way to go ahead and start creating some believable types of environments when you work with the file. If we go ahead and come back to our preview mode right here, let me come down just a little bit and look at our good friend Ryan over here. I let that scroll too far. Hang on, it's going back. We've got some art on the walls here, pretty swank spot. Okay, it's going back and forth. I think while I record this, it's taking a little more system resources right here. All right, stop already. What if we want to go ahead and change some of the ambient occlusion qualities? We can do that globally with the scene ambient occlusion right here. If we click on this, we've got some options here. I've increased the max distance to 2 units, in this case like 2 feet. The bias, again, this is kind of a interesting little thing. I won't describe it, but you can leave that pretty much as it is. The number of samples, if you see that a certain graininess that comes with the ambient lighting shadows, increase the number of samples right here, and that will make it a little bit better. Let me scroll just a little bit, and when we render in the scene right now, we'll go ahead and see it render up quickly, and we've got a pretty reasonable type of presentation of environment. It's a really fast way to go. This is a nice way to go also if you've got indoor plants that have lots of transparency going on, things like that. Also, let's let this finish here real quick so we can see it. You can apply the same ambient occlusion checkbox to any light, a point light, a infinite light, and I've done it also for my sunlight, so it creates the same effects as objects get near. So you can see it's a little bit chunky, the shadows around here, it's a little bit kind of dirty. In fact, increasing the sample count in the scene ambient occlusions will help that out. Well, what if you want realistic type of lighting? If we come up here to preview real quickly, let me orbit around the scene a little bit here just so we get another view. I'll come up, again I told you it's kind of a swanky art interior right here. Here's a render that will go ahead and start at this one scene. You'll see it real quick, and I'm doing this to contrast the image-based lighting in conjunction with indirect lighting, which is something we'll look at in the render controls right here. Get these nice darker corners. Yeah, it's a pretty good fake job. If we increase the samples, you can see how it looks very dirty, and we're getting some irregular types of shadow going on right here. If we increase the sample count, and let me open our render options right here, we've got several things. Pixel samples that we can increase, and I'm going to engage indirect lighting right now. Let's talk about this real quickly. Indirect lighting is basically lights bouncing around the scene. It requires ray tracing being turned on. There's a little feature called ray trace bounces. If you don't have this set at least at 2, you're wasting your time. You need to go ahead and do this so that the light, what it does is it's like a light beam. It hits an object, picks up color, and moves to the next object, transfer that color, and then it bounces again. So a minimum of 2, usually something more like 4, gives you some good results. And the indirect lighting quality, we can increase this, understanding that every time you increase either the indirect light quality or the pixel samples, that you will also be extending the render time. Let's go ahead and do render now. What's going on in the scene is we'll start seeing a bunch of red dots. This is the program calculating how the light gathers in the corners and where the darker areas are going to be, as well as the bounced light as it moves around the scene. So it goes through this pre-pass of the render, and then it's going to start rendering, and we'll see a completely different look to the scene as it starts doing that. Once you turn on the indirect lighting feature, that nice general type of lighting look that we get when we use the image-based lighting kind of goes away, and what it starts doing is actually calculating how the light bounces around the scene. Now look, this is still rendering pretty quickly. Let's go ahead and close this up, but we also have what I would call is an inferior render right now because we're using low render settings. When we increase the values that we have right here in the render settings for indirect lighting quality, if we crank this up right around 50 here and we increase our pixel samples to something like 20, these issues that we're dealing with about kind of the dirty walls start to go away, and we start to illuminate the dark spaces more easily and more believably. So it becomes a question then, when you work with your interiors, does it make more sense to use just the IBL with the ambient occlusion engaged, or use the indirect lighting? The indirect lighting, when you crank up the settings on it, is superior in its results and quality, but you get to pay for it in time. So if we go ahead and turn that option off again, indirect lighting, and then we render, then we're going to get a relatively clean scene. We can adjust the darkness of the light in the corners simply by adjusting the ambient occlusion values for the lights or the shaders, depending on where you engage that, universally on the light or specifically by the shader material. So these are ways to more quickly increase the reality of your interior scenes working with normal maps and reflections. If I come to the glass, you would see me pulling off all those little tricks that I did earlier where we add that light node into the reflection values. Just some really cool ways to improve your renders working inside with some of the features inside of POSER.